and network stations across Australia. Afternoons with Sofie Formica.
Yeah, we are once again talking about the situation we have in Queensland when it comes to youth crime and youth justice, because so many of us have now seen our feelings of sadness turn to real anger, and rightfully so. Politicians don't want the lives lost that we are talking about to be politicised. And it's a really easy line, isn't it, for them to say, I don't want to talk about it now because this is above politics. It's the perfect thing to say when you don't want to have to address something. But we know it actually is the politics that is going to be the thing that changes the situation and is a huge part of the problem that we're facing. If we set aside what I think are the endless debates now and the massive egos and the power struggle in the shadow, again, of what I said earlier is a looming state election, we're reminded that the real power is reminding our politicians that they're the ones that can change it through legislation. Legislation that will shape the very essence of how we continue to coexist as a society. And we're talking about the fact that you're telling me you don't feel safe in your streets and in your homes. We know that it's impacting daily lives. We know every aspect of our safety and our well-being is at their hands. And for years now, and certainly for as long as I've been doing this program, we have witnessed the repercussions of the blame shifting and weak policies. We've seen revolving door of ministers' portfolios, the ones who are most acutely responsible for the complicated social issues that impact crime. We now know that both the previous Premier and this one is really quick to move the spotlight to police and to the role of the judiciary, not to mention that we have had endless reviews, we've had task forces, we've got roundtables, we've got parliamentary committees, and nothing is shifting the dial.
No matter where you are across Australia or around the globe, you're welcome right here. This is another Nine Radio broadcast.
So joining me now on 4BC Afternoons is Dr Terry Goldsworthy. He's Associate Professor of Criminology at Bond University. He's got more than 28 years of policing experience. He's also at the bar, so he knows what happens on both sides of the fence. And he's once again my guest on 4BC Afternoons. Thanks for your time today, Terry.
Yeah, good afternoon, Sophie.
Here we go again, Terry. It's a high-profile case that's once again shunned the spotlight. We've got a grieving innocent family. It feels like Groundhog Day.
Yeah, look, you're not wrong. I mean, these matters continually keep occurring, and you're seeing the same kind of themes come up in them. You know, young people out committing crimes, armed with knives, and then we find out that they were subject to bail applications, that they were given bail and released. You know, these are the issues that we have identified now for many, probably going on 12, 18 months. You know, we know that 53% of young people on bail reoffend. The Atkinson report told us that. We know that of those young people on bail, 19% commit serious offending and 7% go on to commit an offence that involves death or serious injury, which we saw occur on a weekend. So, you know, why is that still occurring? Why are we still getting people released on bail who are simply a threat to the community? It shouldn't be occurring.
You mentioned the Atkinson review, Terry, and, you know, there was the original report that was in 2019. Then a review of that review was released in 2022 that showed exactly those statistics that you just outlined to us. And when you look at the Youth Justice Act, that you would, I'm sure, know inside out and back to front, the principles of that charter, the first one is the community should be safe, particularly from serious repeat youth offenders, that young people should be held accountable and encouraged to accept responsibility for what they've done, and that the youth justice system should uphold the rights of children, keep them safe and promote their physical and well-being, and that consideration be given to their age and maturity based on, you know, their cultural, religious beliefs and all of those things. When it comes to those first few principles, I don't know how you could listen to that and say that we have not fallen short, that we have not failed to be able to uphold those principles with the Act as it currently stands.
Yeah, you're quite correct. What we've seen over a period, it wasn't last year or two, I think effectively started back in 2016 when we had the offensive bail breach for juveniles removed, and we had detention as a last resort put in as an overriding principle. And there's a really good criminal justice timeline available on the Treasury Department statistician website, which goes through all of the amendments that the current government and previous governments have made over the last 10 years. And you can see where the rot started. And we've become offender-centric, where everything in terms of youth justice was about the offender. Now, in any criminal transaction, you have the offender, the state and the victim, and the victim became a forgotten party.
Yeah.
And I think it's only in the last 6 months or so where we've seen the community galvanise that suddenly the government has gone, oh, you know what, there's victims involved in this too. We better start considering what their input is.
Yeah, I note that you actually have written about this very clearly. In fact, as early as last year, you wrote an opinion piece when it comes to the other, big issue at the moment, and that is the transparency of what happens in children's courts.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, yet again, we saw 5 young people charged, and I think 1 allowed access to the hearings. I mean, I really think that the government needs to take the initiative on this. It's no point sitting back and going, look, we're not happy that the magistrates didn't let you in, but that's their decision, so we can't do anything about it. They can do something about it. Stephen Miles can put a bill to Parliament whenever it sits next. And I'm sure that the opposition would be bipartisan supporting that for serious offending. We're not talking about people with, minor stealings or things like that, but people who've got serious offences against them, such as life imprisonment or 14 years in excess outcomes, that we are privy to what happens in those court proceedings. And it's simply called, the New South Wales Law Reform Commission, termed it as open justice, where the principle is that the administration of justice should take place in public. And I think that would go a long way to assisting in ensuring the legitimacy of the criminal justice system in the eyes of the community. What we're seeing now is decisions that we just cannot understand how they were made, and we don't know how they were made because they're done behind closed doors. That needs to change, and the government can change it.
Terry, a lot of the listeners and I would really like to get a better understanding of how bail works. The community clearly has no appetite for accepting that a criminal, child or otherwise, is granted bail and then reoffends. And this idea that, particularly when it comes to youth crime, that you have a child who either is granted bail and then goes into some kind of care of the state where there seems to be a lack of supervision and there's obviously issues there, or they go into the care of an adult or some sort of, parent figure who takes some responsibility for them when they're back out in the community. Can you help us understand where bail falls down? Because people will blame the judiciary, and I've said they'll only work within the laws that they have to have in front of them, right?
Well, that's right. So, the judges will look at a number of factors such as their antecedents. Are they at home? Do they have a set of supportive parenting system in place? What is their previous offending? What's happened with their previous, bail conditions given to them? Have they offended and things like that? And the seriousness of the offending and their threat to the community. What we've seen is, a show cause provision put in place, which still doesn't seem to be effectively stopping many of these young offenders getting out. And we're talking about the serious repeat offenders here, which, commit about 50% of the crime and make up a small proportion of about 20% of all youth offenders. So, I mean, they keep getting out. But I guess if you look at things like, for instance, the electronic monitoring devices that we were promised in 2019 would be given to youth offenders and would be used to combat youth offending. When they were issued, they were only issued to youth who were in a stable environment, were willing to have the MD placed on them and had a supportive guardian in place with them. So they're not the people who are likely to offend. We now know, in the last month, we've got some data came out in Parliament that only 29 EMDs had been issued at a cost of some $11.5 million. So it's about $400,000 for each electronic monitoring device issued. But the real kicker is that when you look at the Atkinson report, it tells us that in terms of the monitoring of the devices, the only time the police are required to respond is if it is removed or tampered. So if you have Jim, who's on a curfew, can't go out between 10 and 6 a.m, and his EMD shows him out and about at a suburb where he shouldn't be at 1 o'clock in the morning, there is no response. what they do is they ring him and ask him to go home. So it's just ludicrous how we're putting these things in place, and it's the detail that we find out that we then realise why these things aren't working.
I know that this is probably a loaded question for you, but as I said, you've seen this now from all sides, and this idea that there is nothing more that can be done, I think, is the thing that is infuriating people the most. Do we need a complete overhaul of the Youth Justice Act so that it is actually fit for purpose in 2024?
Well, certainly I think it's not helpful when you have the Premier say no one's going to stop youth crime, because we don't expect the government to stop youth crime, we expect them to control it, and they're distinctly different issues. I think we do need someone external to the government to come in and look at what's being done in terms of effective responses. I mean, if you look at youth offending, there's three areas. One is, how does the youth fall into offending? And often that comes back to just, in many cases, poor parenting. We know that the causal factors around youth offending include DV in the household, parents who are incarcerated, drug use by the youth themselves and also the adults in the house, a lack of engagement with education, and a lack of skills to gain employment. So, how does the youth get in that position? What fail-safes do we have to protect the youth who's in that position? I think we're failing there. We're then failing in terms of protecting the community when a youth is out, a serious repeat offender is out committing a crime spree. We're not keeping them on bail. They're not taking the action to prevent the repetitive offences. And then I think there's also another gap at the other end, long-term offending cycle, where we're not rehabilitating these kids. I mean, if we don't rehabilitate them, they'll just keep committing crime and become career criminals. Some will go on to do that no matter what you do. But there would be a certain group, a number of that group, who you could target and rehabilitate. And if we don't address all three of those areas, and the middle one is the one I think we've been terribly deficient in protecting the community, then we're not going to get on top of this. And it doesn't matter how many people get appointed as new Assistant Commissioner for Youth Crime. You seem to have a merry-go of people leaving that position within the QPS. It doesn't matter who you put in there, they won't achieve anything. So we've got to get serious about addressing youth crime. If you look at how we approached the bikie issue, and there were 950 bikies in Queensland. We put 200 police on to doing nothing but bikies. We have about 460 or so, at last count, serious repeat youth offenders, almost probably half the number of bikies. Yet you haven't seen that dedication of hundreds of police to do nothing but focus on those offenders.
Professor Terry Goldsworthy is my guest this afternoon, criminologist at Bond University, also a police officer and in the force for 30-odd years. If you've got a question for Terry, you can send me through a text 0499 880 882. I'm going to keep him with me just a little bit longer. I wanted to play a little of what Stephen Miles had to say yesterday when it comes to youth crime, which I think, as you said, Terry, we have to be able to look at the people who we are charging with making the changes that we so desperately need and wonder whether or not they're fit for purpose too. We'll return in just a moment. It's 1:20. Professor Terry Goldsworthy, my guest this afternoon on the subject of youth crime. And Terry, a few of the listeners want, again, this better understanding of this bail situation, knowing that we have so many repeat offenders who seem to have been granted it, and whether or not, when it comes to kids, is there a surety that's required?
Yeah, look, I can't answer specifics on that. Generally, they need to ensure that there's a suitable adult for them to go and reside, which seems to be the key issue they look for, rather than a monetary outcome that you might do with an adult. So, I mean, it comes down to, again, that risk assessment the court is doing in terms of what risk does that child pose to the community. So I don't think a surety would necessarily fix that. It may motivate someone to pay more attention to what the child is doing. But, the issue is, does it lessen the risk to the community? Probably no, it wouldn't if there were sureties in place anyway.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, and just for those who might have only joined us, the review from the Atkinson report 2022, as you said earlier, reoffending young people on bail had increased. 53% of young people, as you said, reoffended while on bail, 19% committing serious offenders. And then unfortunately, and I think this is quite high, to think that 7% committed an offence that led to death or serious injury while they were on bail. And when the Premier was asked about changes to youth justice yesterday, and in particular what unfolded at Redbank Plains over the weekend, and whether or not it could have been avoided. This is what he said.
Nobody can seriously stand up and say they could have prevented this murder. You know, I've heard some politicians go very close to saying that they'd guarantee they could have prevented this murder. That's a pretty incredible statement to be trying to make.
I think, Terry, the reason I wanted to play that is that we have seen two very high-profile murders allegedly at the hands of juvenile offenders who were on bail. And we know in one case, police opposed bail. To suggest that a murder could not have been prevented if an alleged offender wasn't on the streets, I have to say, is a little tone deaf.
Yeah, look, I just think, I don't know what Stephen Miles was thinking saying that. I mean, clearly, if a bail decision had kept that person in, it's highly unlikely this may have occurred. Ultimately, you know, if there were more police on the beat, they may have been able to, check these people bail conditions and, pay them a visit and say, what have you been up to, and let them know they're under observation. I mean, the thing is, you've got the leader of our government has reappointed in the last few weeks the police minister and also the youth justice minister, two ministers who, under their watch, we have seen the situation unfold. So at what stage does ministerial responsibility kick in? I mean, if you look at our police service, for instance, I mean, they're working their guts out. I mean, I speak to police all the time in my movements around town, down the Gold Coast here. But, there's problems for the police. I mean, last year there were 200 less police on the beat than there were in 2022. They can't fill the vacancies of police leaving. The last survey they did last year on the police showed that only 29% of them had a positive view of the senior police leadership, and 50% indicated that they wanted to leave their positions in the next 2 years. So, you add that kind of morale issue inside the police internally. Clear-up rates where we arrest people for offences have declined. Reported crime has gone up. The latest data I saw for last year shows that overall the crime rate in Queensland has risen 8% again. So we've got crime going up. We've got police who are under pressure trying to deal with these things. We have a court system that doesn't seem to be operating the way we want it to, but the government just says, well, that's the way it operates. Well, you can legislate to fix that.
Yeah.
Premier, go and take your bill to Parliament and then tighten up these bail laws, open up the courts to transparency. That is simply a matter of legislation.
Yeah, look, you said it so perfectly. And I think it was a real slap in the face, honestly, to be able to then turn this back and say, well, police were the ones who were there, who helped us, form the laws that they're now working within, I think was, again, also incredibly tone deaf. I think that I have heard now from people like yourself and so many other people who are a part of the Queensland Police Service, and we hear from our listeners who have police at their door showing them CCTV footage of kids where they say they know who they are and they feel powerless to be able to do anything about it.
Well, that's right. And look, it's not going to get any better, Sophie, because every government in Australia, and our government, Queensland government's one of them, has in principle agreed to raise the age of criminals' responsibility from 10 to 12, with the ultimate aim raising it to 14. Okay. So you face the prospect of having these 10 to 13-year-olds racing around committing crime that will never be held accountable. And when they hit 14, there'll be a supercharged cohort of criminals that we will suddenly expect to behave. And it's not going to happen.
Terry, one final thing before I let you go this afternoon, and I thank you so much for giving me so much of your time. We keep talking about going upstream, going further back to the source. How do we make sure that we're capturing the 3 or 4-year-old before he or she is that 13 or 14-year-old who then finds themselves embroiled in crime as a youth? Do you think enough is being done there, and that we have got the right people tasked with making the changes and putting the resources in place at that end of this problem?
Oh, look, I don't think we have. These things cost a lot of money. They take a lot of time. I mean, we do a whole range of testing for people to drive vehicles. There's no test to become a parent. We just allow people to do it and hope that they have good parenting skills, which is one of the main reasons why kids fall off the rails. There's a lot more money that could be spent on there and assisting people to become good parents to ensure their children come up with the values that we expect in society. And until we start investing in those areas, it's going to be problematic. The police often, the senior police go, we can't arrest our way out of this. That is true to some extent. You do need other government departments coming in and picking up the slack. And prevention is far better than cure. If you can solve the familial issues in terms of the causative effects of why a child might become an offender,
yep.
You're going to solve the police having to arrest them later in jail time and all those associated costs.
Thank you again for your time this afternoon, and I hope we have the opportunity to speak to you again.
Thanks, Sofie.
That's Professor Terry Goldsworthy, criminologist at Bond University. And just on the subject that he also mentioned there about police numbers, I did also note yesterday the Premier was very quick to say that under his watch we've got 1,600 new police. We found it very hard to find data that would actually back that up clearly. The latest QPS data put out by police is that the substantive headcount of police officers as of November last year was 12,105. which compared to 12,225 as of June 2023. So it's actually a whole decrease of 120. I will say that there are many that seem to be in the recruitment pipeline, some 2,000 by their accounts, but whether or not those people actually join the force and what the actual net increase is very difficult to ascertain. Thank you for your feedback this afternoon. To a couple of calls, Jimmy's on the line this afternoon from Eden's Landing. Nice to talk to you, Jimmy.
Yeah, how are you, Stokes?
What are you?